The grand ballroom of Pembry Court was a galaxy of light, 1,000 candles blazing in the chandeliers, their brilliance captured in the diamonds that glittered on the necks and wrists of the county's finest. The orchestra was mid-waltz, a confection of strings and soaring flutes that filled the vast space, yet it was not the music that held the attention of the 300 guests. It was the woman who stood in the great, arched doorway. She had not been announced. She had simply appeared, and her presence had spread through the room like a drop of ink in water, silencing conversations and stilling dancing feet. The Duke of Fenwick, standing near the musicians with a glass of champagne in his hand, saw her, and the color drained from his face. His sister, Lady Beatrice, who was holding court by the fireplace, let her painted fan snap shut with a crack that was audible in the sudden hush. Across the floor, a man with a sharp city suit and an anxious expression. The Duke's estate manager, Mr. Davies, froze with a canapé halfway to his lips. The woman was his wife, Ruth, Duchess of Fenwick. She was supposed to be upstairs, nursing one of the delicate headaches the Duke so often ascribed to her. But she was not pale or delicate now. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk, a color so deep it seemed to drink the candlelight. It was severe in its cut, unadorned by the fashionable frills and flounces that decorated every other woman in the room, and it gave her the solemnity of a judge. She wore no jewels save for a single strand of pearls. In her gloved hands, she carried not a fan or a reticule, but a slim leather portfolio. The silence deepened, becoming heavy, expectant. The orchestra faltered, one violin squeaking into the quiet before it too fell still. Ruth's gaze swept the room, calm and unhurried, and then she began to walk. She did not rush. Her steps were measured on the polished oak floor, a slow procession toward the center of the room, toward her husband. With every step, the whispers died, until the only sound was the rustle of her silk skirts. She stopped before the Duke, though she did not look at him. She looked at the guests, her audience, her jury. She untied the ribbons of the portfolio with steady fingers and opened it. But to understand the silence that fell upon that room, a silence more profound than the absence of music. We must return to the beginning, to the day she first arrived, a woman ordered like a piece of furniture and determined to be anything but. If you enjoy stories of quiet strength and public vindication, subscribe for more. And let us know in the comments where you are watching from today. The arrangement was a matter of ink and paper, a transaction between two families who had never met. The Duke of Fenwick required a dowry of £20,000 to mend the leaky finances of his ancient title, and the late Mr. Alcott of Dorset had left behind a daughter of 26, a substantial fortune, and a reputation for an unfashionable sort of competence. Ruth Alcott arrived at Pembry Court on a Tuesday in October, stepping down from a plain traveling carriage in a gray wool dress that had already seen 2 seasons. The butler, who had been expecting silks and a lady's maid, saw a woman of medium height, with steady brown eyes and hands that were not fashionably pale, but looked capable. Behind her, 2 footmen struggled with a trunk that seemed unusually heavy. It was not filled with gowns and bonnets, but with ledgers, survey maps, and books on crop rotation. She carried with her a letter of commendation from her father's solicitor, and no apparent intention of performing the decorative submission the entire household had been prepared for. The Duke, Arthur, met her in the great hall, a space designed to intimidate with its soaring, hammer-beam roof and portraits of his ancestors glowering from the walls. He was handsome, with the easy charm of a man who had never been denied anything. He saw her plain dress and her serious expression, and was, to his own surprise, relieved. She would be manageable. "Welcome to Pembury, my dear," he said, taking her hand and bestowing a cool, proprietary kiss upon its back. "I trust your journey was not too tiresome." Ruth's first impression was of a man who smelled faintly of brandy and self-satisfaction. "It was efficient, Your Grace," she replied, her voice clear and low. The roads were well maintained. It was not the romantic or flustered reply he had expected. He led her into the morning room for tea. The room was beautiful, with faded rose-patterned silks on the walls and delicate porcelain on the tables. But Ruth's eyes noted the slight tremor in the floorboards and the draft coming from the ill-fitting window sash. The tea was served with lemon cakes and sugared strawberries, a gesture of extravagant welcome. In those first weeks, a fragile peace settled over the house. Arthur found his new wife's quiet nature restful. He mistook her silence for docility, her observant gaze for simple-minded awe. He would take her on walks through the gardens, pointing out the ancient yew trees and the crumbling folly. "My great-grandfather won the deed to this land in a game of cards," he would say with a proud laugh. Ruth, meanwhile, was noting the state of the greenhouses, their glass panes cracked and the vines within untended. They ate their dinners in the vast dining room, often alone, the table a great expanse of polished mahogany between them. The cook, a Mrs. Gable, produced roast pheasant with glazed carrots and buttered asparagus, dishes designed to impress a new duchess. Ruth ate with a good appetite and complimented the cook by name, a small act that sent ripples of surprise through the servants' hall. One evening, Arthur found her in the library, not with a novel, but with a large estate map spread across the table, sketching lines on a separate piece of paper. "What is this, my dear?" he asked, amused. "My country hobby," she replied, not looking up. "I was merely comparing the crop yields from the home farm as described in these records from 1780 with the current output." He chuckled, patting her shoulder. "Leave the tiresome figures to the professionals, Ruth. A duchess has more important things to concern herself with. The color of the new curtains, for example." He meant it kindly, a gentle steering toward her proper sphere. But it was the first tremor of the earthquake to come. The shift began subtly, a change in the weather of the house. The Duke returned from a fortnight at his London club, and the patronizing amusement he had shown his new wife had curdled into something colder. His friends, men of similar rank and indolence, had likely mocked him for marrying a farmer's daughter, no matter how wealthy. His pride, a delicate and easily bruised thing, required him to establish his dominance. The first public lesson was delivered at a dinner party. The table glittered with the Pembury silver, and the conversation was a light soufflé of London gossip and politics. A neighboring lord, making polite conversation, turned to Ruth. "And what of Dorset, Your Grace? A fine county for sheep, I'm told." Ruth, who had spent 5 years transforming her father's failing sheep farm into the most profitable in the region, began to speak with quiet authority about new methods of breeding and wool production. She was halfway through a sentence when Arthur interrupted her with a booming laugh that made the wine glasses tremble. "My dear, you will bore our guests to tears with talk of livestock," he exclaimed, winking at the lady to his right. "This is a dining room, not a barn. Tell them instead about your needlepoint." "I'm sure it is." "Excellent." A ripple of polite laughter went around the table. It was the laughter of people who understood the rules, who knew that a wife, especially a new one from the provinces, was not meant to have expertise in anything but the domestic arts. Ruth felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she did not look down. She met her husband's smiling, dismissive gaze, held it for a beat, and then placed her fork carefully on her plate. She said nothing for the rest of the meal, her posture a study in perfect, silent composure. The next morning, she approached him in his study, a room that smelled of leather and cigar smoke. His estate manager, Mr. Davies, a man with a perpetually anxious expression and ink-stained fingers, was with him. Ruth held a small ledger. "Arthur," she began, "I was reviewing the household accounts, and I have a question about the quarterly expenditure on seed for the kitchen garden." Arthur didn't even look at the book. He waved a languid hand. "Ruth, these are matters for men. Davies handles everything, don't you, Davies?" Mr. Davies nodded eagerly. "Of course, Your Grace. The Duchess need not trouble her pretty head." The Duke smiled, his cruelty packaged as concern. "Precisely. Why don't you go and see to the flower arrangements for the weekend party? That's a much more suitable project." She left the study, the unopened ledger still in her hand. The dismissal was absolute. She was not a partner, she was a decoration, and a faulty one at that. The erosion of her position accelerated with the arrival of the Duke's widowed sister, Lady Beatrice, for an extended visit. Beatrice was a woman whose own minor title and dwindling fortune had left her with nothing but a sharp tongue and a desperate need to feel superior. She saw Ruth's quiet competence not as a virtue, but as a provincial affront to the proper order of things. Her attacks were never direct enough to be confronted, but were delivered as a series of small, poisonous cuts. "That gown, my dear Duchess," she would remark in the drawing-room, her voice carrying. "Is that what they are truly wearing in the shires this season? How practical." At tea, she would watch Ruth pour. "In London, my dear, we pour the milk in after the tea. It is a small thing, of course, but these small things are how one tells." Ruth endured it all with an unreadable placidity. She did not argue or defend herself. She simply absorbed the slights and stored them away. She spent more and more of her time in the vast, dusty library, a room Arthur never entered. She wasn't reading novels. She was reading the history of his family, not in the gilded biographies on the upper shelves, but in the leather-bound estate records that lined the bottom ones, charting the slow, steady mismanagement of a great fortune over 3 generations. The isolation was methodical, administrative. The Duke began to travel to London for social events, taking his sister with him. He would leave Ruth at Pembury Court with a casual, "You are so much happier in the country, my dear. The city air does not agree with your constitution." He was not asking, he was informing her of her own preference. She was to be the rustic duchess, a quaint fixture of the estate, kept far from the society where her earnestness and lack of fashionable wit might embarrass him. The grand London townhouse in Mayfair remained closed. The invitations that arrived addressed to the Duke and Duchess were answered by his secretary, accepting on his behalf and regretting that the Duchess was indisposed. Her world shrank to the confines of the park walls, but within those walls, she began to find small, unexpected sources of information. The head groundskeeper's son, a bright-eyed boy of 10 named Tom, would often follow her as she walked the grounds, drawn to her quiet manner. One afternoon, as she was examining the blight on the rose bushes, he asked, "Your Grace, why does the Duke call your books her ladyship's scribblings?" He said it with the simple curiosity of a child, repeating what he had overheard. The innocent question landed with more force than any of Lady Beatrice's calculated barbs. It was a perfect, unvarnished reflection of her husband's contempt. That same week, she confirmed it with her own ears. She was walking down the servants' corridor that ran behind the west wing, carrying a book on animal husbandry she had retrieved from a storage room. As she passed the thick oak door of the Duke's study, she heard voices raised in laughter. It was Arthur and his estate manager, Mr. Davies. "She asked about the West Meadow rents again this morning," Davies said, his tone a sycophantic imitation of the Duke's own condescension. "She has the mind of a shopkeeper, that one." The Duke's reply was a low chuckle. "Let her have her little games with her account books. Her dowry has been most useful. As long as she remains in the country, counting the chickens, she can do no harm." Ruth stopped dead in the corridor, her knuckles white where she gripped the book. It wasn't anger she felt, not at first. It was a cold, clarifying certainty. They did not see her as a person. They saw her as a resource to be exploited and a problem to be managed. Standing there in the dim, echoing hallway, she made a silent promise to herself. She would not be managed. She turned and walked, not to her rooms to weep, but to the small writing desk in the corner of the library. She penned a discreet letter to Mr. Hemlock, her late father's solicitor in Dorset, a man of quiet integrity and formidable legal skill. She asked if he might be available to advise her on a matter of investment management. Ruth's investigation began in earnest, conducted under the guise of domesticity. She told the Duke she intended to create a new, modern catalog of the Pembury Library, a task so mind-numbingly tedious that he readily agreed, glad to have her occupied. For weeks she spent 10 hours a day in the dusty silence, not cataloging poetry, but poring over a century of estate maps, rent rolls, and tithe records. She laid them out on the long library table, comparing the detailed surveys from the 18th century with the crude, incomplete maps provided by Mr. Davies. She began to notice discrepancies. Small copses of woodland that were on the old maps had vanished from the new ones. A tenant cottage and its adjoining 3 acres, listed as occupied in the 1840 census, were simply gone from the current rent roll, with no record of the tenant's departure or the land's reassignment. It was death by 1,000 cuts, small parcels of the estate being shaved off at the edges. Next, she turned her attention to the household accounts, the very ledgers the Duke had forbidden her to inspect. She did not take them from his study. Instead, she made a simple request to Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, for the kitchen and stables account books, claiming a desire to find economies in household spending. Mrs. Gable, a woman who had served the Dukes of Fenwick for 40 years, and who saw more than she ever spoke of, brought them to her without question. In the tidy columns of figures, Ruth found the rot. There were duplicate invoices for the same deliveries of hay and oats. There were payments to a blacksmith in a village 20 miles away, when the estate had its own smithy. There were receipts for vast quantities of expensive French seed for the kitchen garden, a garden Ruth knew was being supplied from their own greenhouse stock. Each transaction was small, a few pounds here, a few shillings there, but when she tallied them over the past 3 years, they amounted to a staggering sum. It was a slow, systematic bleeding of the estate's lifeblood. One evening, as Mrs. Gable brought a cup of warm milk to the Duchess in the library, she paused by the table covered in papers. "Mr. Davies is not the man his father was, Your Grace," the housekeeper said, her voice barely a whisper. "The old Duke checked every book himself. The tenants do not trust this one." It was not an accusation, but a statement of fact, and it was all the confirmation Ruth needed. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place by accident. Ruth was in a small, forgotten records room that adjoined the study, searching for a 17th century deed she had seen referenced in another document. The room was cold and smelled of decaying paper. The door to the study, a heavy oak panel, had been left slightly ajar. She heard the murmur of voices and froze. One was Mr. Davies. The other was a man she did not recognize, his accent sharp and metropolitan. "The consortium is prepared to offer £30,000 for the parcel," the stranger said. "The North Wood and the 5 tenant farms along the river. We need the land for the new railway line." Davies's voice was oily. "His Grace understands the necessity of discretion. The tenants believe they are to have their leases renewed." Just then, a third voice joined them. The Duke's. He sounded agitated. "Will the funds be transferred before the quarter's end? My creditors are becoming insistent." The stranger's reply was clipped and businesslike. "Once we have your signature on the final agreement, the funds will be released within the week." In that one exchange, overheard through a crack in a door, the entire scheme was laid bare. The secret, illegal sale of tenanted land, the lies to the families who had worked it for generations, and the desperate, foolish greed of her husband, all orchestrated by the man he trusted implicitly. Ruth backed away from the door, her heart pounding not with fear, but with a cold, righteous fury. The game was no longer about her pride. It was about the survival of Pembury and the lives of its people. Action replaced anger. The following morning, Ruth ordered the carriage, informing the household she was traveling to the market town of Oakhampton to purchase silks for new draperies. In a dusty private room above a tea shop, she met not a silk merchant, but Mr. Hemlock, her solicitor, who had traveled overnight from Dorset in response to her urgent summons. She laid out her findings on the rickety table, her hand-drawn copies of Davies's ledgers next to her own reconstructed accounts, the discrepancies in the estate maps highlighted in red ink, and a detailed summary of the conversation she had overheard. Mr. Hemlock, a man who rarely showed emotion, listened intently, his expression growing more grave with each document she produced. "He is selling entailed land, Your Grace," he said, his voice grim. "Land that is tied to the title and cannot be sold, and he is defrauding his tenants. This is a matter for the courts." "The courts would create a scandal that would ruin the Fenwick name forever," Ruth replied calmly. "I want to save the estate, not destroy its reputation. I have another way." She then gave him a set of instructions that made the old lawyer's eyebrows rise. She had insisted, during her marriage negotiations, that her dowry of £20,000 be placed in a trust under her sole control, a provision Arthur had laughed at as another of her provincial quirks, but which he had agreed to, eager to get his hands on the income it generated. Now, Ruth instructed Mr. Hemlock to use a significant portion of that capital. "There is a London bank," she said, consulting her notes. "Barings and Company. They hold the Duke's largest and most pressing mortgage note, to the sum of £15,000. I have learned they are preparing to foreclose. I want you to buy that debt, anonymously." Mr. Hemlock understood at once. She was not merely gathering evidence, she was acquiring power. As the Duke's primary creditor, she would hold his fate and the fate of Pembury in her hands. While he was in London, she sent a trusted messenger to her family home in Dorset, requesting a large trunk of her late father's papers be sent to her. It arrived a week later, filled with old legal documents, surveys, and deeds. For days she studied them, teaching herself the precise language and form of a legal land transfer, until she could spot a forgery at 20 paces. Finally, she sat at her desk and penned personal notes to 5 of the most powerful and respected landowners in the county, men whose integrity was beyond question. She invited them to attend the Duke's upcoming annual gala, but requested they arrive an hour early for a private consultation on a matter of grave regional importance. The Duke, seeing the flurry of activity, assumed she was consumed with preparations for the ball. He saw only a quiet, defeated woman arranging flowers and fussing over menus, and he had never felt more secure. The night of the annual Pembrey Gala arrived on a wave of cold, clear air. The estate glittered, every window ablaze, carriages lining the long oak drive. In his dressing room, the Duke of Fenwick was in the highest of spirits. He hummed a tune from a London opera as his valet adjusted the starched white wings of his collar. He caught his own eye in the gilded mirror. A handsome, powerful man on the cusp of a great victory. The land sale was complete, the money secretly transferred. Tonight after supper, he would announce a triumphant new investment that had secured Pembury's future, and no one would be any the wiser. He would be free of his debts, free of the whispers, a master in his own house once more. He glanced across the hall into his wife's dressing room. Ruth was sitting by the window, looking out into the darkness. "Not feeling up to the evening, my dear?" he called out, his voice laced with the condescending kindness he now favored. "No matter. The excitement can be overwhelming. Best you rest." He did not wait for an answer. Ruth's preparations had been a silent, deliberate ritual. She had dismissed her maid an hour before, preferring to be alone. She did not choose one of the fashionable, pastel-colored gowns the Duke had purchased for her, and which she had never worn. Instead, she laid out the gown of midnight blue silk, a garment she had commissioned herself from a modest London dressmaker. Its beauty was in its structure, its perfect, unadorned lines. It was the color of a starless night, the color of judgment. She coiled her dark hair simply at the nape of her neck and affixed the only jewelry she would wear, the single strand of pearls her father had given her on her 18th birthday. They felt cool and solid against her skin, a reminder of a world where value was measured in character, not in titles. She went down the back stairs to the kitchens, where the air was thick with the scent of roasting meat and baking bread. She found Mrs. Gable by the ovens. "When Mr. Hemlock and the other gentlemen arrive," Ruth said in a low voice, "have them shown to the West Library. Serve them brandy and see that they are not disturbed. Tell no one else they are here." The housekeeper simply nodded, her expression one of fierce, unspoken loyalty. Returning to her room, Ruth opened her leather portfolio and reviewed its contents one last time. The forged land agreement, Davies's falsified ledgers, laid beside her own meticulous corrections. Sworn and signed affidavits from 2 of the River Farm tenants, testifying that Davies had collected rents for which they were never given receipts. And at the very bottom, the crisp, notarized deed of debt, transferring ownership of the Duke's mortgage from Barings and Company to a trust controlled by one Ruth Alcott Fenwick. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her face in the mirror was pale but composed. She was not a wife seeking revenge. She was a steward, preparing for a long and painful audit. The ballroom was at the zenith of its splendor. The orchestra played a Viennese waltz, and the floor was a swirling kaleidoscope of silk, satin, and regimental scarlet. The Duke of Fenwick stood near a towering arrangement of lilies, accepting the compliments of his guests, his chest puffed with pride. He was laughing with the sharp-faced man from the railway consortium when the music and the room fell silent. Ruth was standing in the doorway. The details of her entrance rippled through the crowd. The severe dark gown, the absence of jewels, the strange leather portfolio she carried. It was the starkness of her appearance that commanded such attention, a slash of midnight blue in a sea of pale pastels. She was a living rebuke to the evening's frivolous gaiety. She began her walk across the polished floor. The crowd parted before her, as if she were a ship breaking through ice. She walked not to her husband, but to the very center of the room, a small, still point in the vast, silent space. Just as she reached it, the doors of the West Library opened, and Mr. Hemlock emerged, followed by the 5 landowners she had summoned. They were the most powerful men in the county, their faces grim and set. They arranged themselves in a silent semicircle behind her, a wall of unimpeachable moral authority. The Duke, his face a mask of purple fury, finally found his voice. "Ruth, what is the meaning of this spectacle? Return to your rooms at once." She did not look at him. She addressed the assembled company, her voice not loud, but carrying with crystalline clarity into every corner of the suddenly tomb-like room. "My lords, ladies, and gentlemen, forgive this interruption. You are guests tonight at Pembury Court, an estate built on centuries of good faith between the Duke and his tenants. A faith that has, I am afraid, been broken." She opened her portfolio and laid the first document on a small, gilded table nearby. "This," she announced, "is an agreement purporting to sell the North Wood and the 5 river farms to the Great Western Railway." A collective gasp went through the room. Land that is entailed to the Fenwick title. Land that is not his Grace's to sell. She then laid down 2 ledgers side by side. For 3 years, the estate has been systematically looted by its manager, Mr. Davies, to the sum of £20,000, through a campaign of forged invoices and unrecorded rents. Mr. Davies, who had been trying to shrink into the damask wallpaper, made a dash for a side door, but 2 footmen, acting on a quiet signal from Mrs. Gable, moved to block his path. The Duke sputtered, "This is preposterous! Lies! She is a hysterical woman who does not understand the complexities of business." For the first time, Ruth turned her eyes to him. Her expression was not one of rage, but of a deep and profound pity. She placed the final document on the table. It landed with a soft, definitive weight. "And finally," she said, her voice dropping to an even quieter register, "the matter of the Duke's considerable personal debts, which this fraudulent scheme was designed to pay. As of Tuesday last, I purchased the entirety of that debt from his creditors. Pembury's master is now beholden to its mistress." The shock in the room was a physical thing. The Duke stared at her, his mouth agape, comprehension dawning in his eyes. He saw not the plain, biddable woman he had married, but a stranger, a figure of implacable strength. "How could you?" he whispered, the words catching in his throat, a plea for an explanation he could understand. Ruth looked away from him, back to the stunned faces of his peers, the social chorus that had once laughed at her expense. She delivered her final, devastating verdict, with no malice, only the weary clarity of an accountant closing a book that will not balance. "His Grace is an excellent judge of horses. It is a pity he cannot tell a steward from a thief." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum in which the Duke's reputation, his authority, and his pride collapsed into dust. Without another word, Ruth turned and walked out of the ballroom. She did not look back. Mr. Hemlock and her allies followed, leaving the Duke alone in the center of his ruined world. The aftermath was not a storm, but a quiet, inexorable tide pulling everything out to sea. The gala dissolved not into chaos, but into a hurried, whispering exodus, as carriages were called and guests fled the scene of the execution. Before the last candle was snuffed out, the local magistrate, one of the men Ruth had summoned to the library, had taken a trembling Mr. Davies into custody. The agent from the railway consortium was gone before anyone thought to look for him, a ghost who had never been there at all. For the Duke, the consequences were social, which to him was a fate worse than death. Invitations stopped arriving. Friends who had clapped him on the back now crossed the street to avoid him. When he dared to show his face at his London club a month later, he was met with a wall of frigid civility that was more damning than any insult. He was a pariah. His sister, Lady Beatrice, ever the pragmatist, read the social winds and decamped to Bath within a fortnight, pleading a sudden affliction of the nerves, and never returned. Legally, Arthur was neutered. Ruth, as his wife, could not have him prosecuted without bringing scandal upon the house she now sought to save. But as his sole creditor, she controlled everything. The ironclad marriage settlement, drafted by the canny Mr. Hemlock and dismissed by the Duke as a trifle, gave her absolute control over her own fortune and significant power over the household's management. She did not divorce him. She did not banish him. Her justice was more subtle and far more complete. He was permitted to remain at Pembury Court, a powerless phantom rattling around in the grand, silent rooms. He ate his meals alone in the small breakfast parlor, served by footmen who now took their orders only from the Duchess. He was a duke in name only, a living relic of a power he had squandered. Ruth, meanwhile, began the painstaking work of restoration. She did not sit in triumph. She went to work. She rode out to every one of the tenant farms, her ledger in her hand. She met with every family, speaking to them not as a duchess, but as a fellow farmer. She reviewed their leases, tore up the fraudulent debt notices issued by Davies, and laid out a fair and transparent system for the collection of rents. Using her own capital, she invested in new drainage for the waterlogged West Meadow and purchased a modern, steam-powered thresher for communal use. She reopened the small school for the tenants' children that the Duke had closed as an unnecessary expense, converting the now silent ballroom into a bright and airy classroom. She did not command respect. She earned it, acre by acre, day by day. A year passed. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the air smelling of wood smoke and damp earth. Ruth stood on a low hill overlooking the West Meadow, which was now a patchwork of healthy green pasture and golden stubble from the harvest. She was not dressed as a duchess. She wore a practical tweed skirt, a thick woolen shawl, and sturdy leather boots that were scuffed with mud. She was watching the groundskeeper's son, young Tom, fly a kite in the brisk wind when she saw a figure walking slowly up the hill toward her. It was the Duke. The year had stripped him of his bluster and his bulk. His fine clothes were clean but worn at the cuffs, and he moved with the hesitant air of a man who was no longer certain of his welcome anywhere on earth. He stopped a few feet from her, his eyes fixed on the muddy toes of his boots. "Ruth," he began, his voice rough from disuse. "Mrs. Gable says you are planning to replant the North Wood with oak." It was a statement, not a question. "It is a good plan." It was the first time he had ever acknowledged her competence, the first time he had spoken of the estate as a thing to be cared for, rather than a thing to be used. He finally raised his head and met her eyes. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, defeated shame. "I have come to ask," he said, the words costing him what little pride he had left, "if you might advance me a small allowance, enough to take modest rooms in the village. It is not right for me to remain at the house. It is your house now." Ruth looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had bought her for her dowry and discarded her for her intelligence. There was no triumph in her gaze, only a quiet, weary sorrow for all that had been wasted, for the partnership that might have been. She saw the empty vessel before her, and knew that the final judgment was not hers to give, but his to live with every day. For a title may be inherited, but authority must be earned, one column of figures at a time. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet vindication. Did the Duke deserve a second chance? Or was his fate just? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. We will be back soon with another story. For pride may be a grand house, but character is the only true home.